Teachers are unhappy with online classes because they might allow parents to understand just how far the public school classroom has been politicized by left-wing propaganda. In other words, they object to the public in public school while treating your kids like Orwellian sociological and psychological lab rats. I'm Dr. Duke, she's Katie, and this is The Dr. Duke Show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Dr. Duke Show, the only program that keeps you educated on the craziness impacting K-12 classrooms and college campuses around the world. Today, we start with an actual whining educator who's just he's got his panties in a bunch because conservative parents in particular might overhear what's going on in the classroom and unmake all of his brainwashing. Right? That about says it all?
That sums it up, I would say. It's actually, he's not just a teacher. He is a Philadelphia teacher, author, and a columnist named Matthew R. Kay. And he expressed his anxiety about the teacher's ability to effectively accomplish their equality inclusion work over Zoom, because, you know, who could be listening in but the public? So what does he do? What does everyone do? They tweet about it. They complain to the world. And so he says, this fall, virtual class discussions will have many potential spectators, parents, siblings, etc. I'm going to go with pets he's missing out on. In the same room, we'll never be quite sure who is overhearing the discourse. What does this do for our equity inclusion work? I don't know. What does it do?
You got diverse kids in your classroom all shown up to learn how to read and write. That is the extent of your equity and inclusion work. You are a teacher. You are not a sociologist. What gives you the right? And the fact that you're bothered by parents looking means that no one's given you the right to take those kids and to turn them into petri dish creatures of your own making. You have no business doing this. And again, if you, with all of your radical progressiveness, if you actually thought you had a mandate to do this, not only would you not be you would not have these anxieties. You would not worry about this. The gall of these people just drives me absolutely nuts.
Well, and the thing is, he was a founding member at Science Leadership Academy, and to be in the sciences and promote leadership and to get all huffy puffy about the fact that adults could be watching what you're teaching to their children.
Science ought to be the one thing you teach kids that people of any age could watch without suffering any politics.
There you go. Well, he is also the author of the book, Not Light, But Fire, How to Lead Meaningful Race Conversations in the Classroom. But he's not in the classroom, he's on the Zoom. And so he continued in his Twitter rant, or thread if you want to call it that. He says, how much have students depended on the somewhat secure barriers of our physical classrooms to encourage vulnerability? How many of us have installed some version of what happens here stays here to help this? Comment,
really?
Please.
This is Las Vegas. The classroom has become, it has become, what's going on in classrooms that make it just like Las Vegas, right? Nobody's learning anything. If anybody who goes to Las Vegas more than once has never learned anything.
Or, well, right? House always wins.
So you're not, you're not learning anything, right? That's how classrooms are like Las Vegas. Now you have all that rampant sex stuff.
Lots of showgirls.
All the sex stuff you would never present your own kids is there, right?
Yep.
in the middle school, high school
Thunder
classroom
down
now.
under. Yep.
And so
that there.
Literally, they've reached the point where Las Vegas is.
And don't forget all the MMA fights that happen in the classroom.
All the MMA
in the hallways.
fights, the drugs, all the drug lecturing about drugs, and now you've got a complete focus on race.
Here's the one thing that's different, though. The buffets are much better in Vegas than they are.
Well, thanks to Michelle Obama.
That's true.
Put those tweets back up there. So
we must continue.
He continues. While conversations about race are in my wheelhouse and remain a concern in this no walls environment, I am most intrigued by the damage that helicopter snowplow parents can do in honest conversations about gender and sexuality. So when we're talking about sex and gender, the Las Vegas stuff, when we're talking about that, the girl comes up to your room for $500 an hour. When we're talking about that, I'm intrigued how much damage parents backward conservative parents, snowplow. Explain for us, Katie. What's a snowplow?
Well,
parent?
I didn't know at first, and the fact that you talked about snowplows and gender and sexuality, I was like, where is this going? But a snowplow parent, they're the, quote, newest embodiment of a hyper-intensive parenting style that can include parents booking their adult children haircuts, texting their college kids to wake them up so they don't sleep through a test, and even calling their kids employers, which... yeah, we got a lot of them out in the world today. Pretty much all of them.
Well, given how people like Kay don't educate kids, they indoctrinate them. We're not teaching kids responsibility. We're not teaching kids life skills. We're not teaching kids math and science and reading and history. So why would they be able to do it themselves? The real question about this is, he acts as if he's the parent. He acts as if he has an absolute entitlement to these kids, and that his message should not be in any way, shape, or form challenged by anybody other than his own students, who won't have a chance to challenge him.
Yeah, and that's why he continues in his little thread saying, and while conservative parents are my chief concern, the fact that he says it out loud.
Right.
He said the quiet part out loud. He says, I know that the damage can come from the left, too. If we are engaged in the messy work of destabilizing a kid's racism or homophobia or transphobia, how much do we want their classmates' parents piling on?
And notice the assumption. Kids are racist, homophobic, and transphobic.
Yep.
So in other words, notice where we are in 2020. To be opposed to any of those things makes you a bigot. There's no debate anymore. There's no two ways of seeing this. There is no way around this. You either agree with me, Matthew K., or you are a bigot and a homophobe and a racist. And that's what bothers you, right? Because that's where parents, maybe even, sir, some parents from the left might get in your way with this, right? The idea that there's one way for a public school, for an educational arena like his, one way of seeing everything. How can you talk out of both sides of your mouth? How do you, Mr. K, how do you argue about diversity and inclusion and equity and balance, and then turn around and insist out of the other side of your serpentine little mouth that there's only one way of seeing everything? Maybe there are even some progressive parents who have enough basic logic to call you out on your BS.
So I know we were talking about Vegas, and Vegas has lots of real estate. They may become to use here in the future, not so distant future, if various schools are still looking for space, especially those from New York City, where Mayor Bill de Blasio and Governor Andrew Cuomo need to find space for their school children. Why? Because apparently they can't just go to school because, we don't have enough room to cater all the kids.
Can I underscore that? May I italicize that for you? So you got all these school rooms, all these classes, all these school buildings in New York City, but you can't use them because of COVID. So what you're going to do is find other buildings to send those kids in spite of COVID.
Mm-hmm. Who do you know who's a New York City real estate developer or had a lot of real estate
I don't know.
that could be purchased? Anyway, New York schools, they've said, okay, we're going to meet in person, at least for now. They've said, okay, we're going to meet in person.
But not at school.
But not at school. So if we're going to meet in person, we need physical space. So, social distancing. It got put out publicly to all of the New York cities in a classified sort of ad, pina colada style. They said, does anyone have space for city schools? I'm just reading that ad. It's called the City School. It has space, I think, for city schools. But I digress. An email was sent to more than 17,000 members of the Real Estate Board of New York. And it said, ideally, the SCA would like to identify feasible and move-in ready spaces that can be occupied with little to no work this September 2020. And they asked for sites with rooms of no less than 650 square feet, dedicated entrances and bathrooms, and outdoor play spaces preferred, but not mandatory.
That sounds like a school.
Yes, and
May I? If you like pina coladas,
Rupert,
and getting caught in the rain, do you like the feel of the ocean and the taste of champagne?
I don't.
Do you like making love at midnight on the dunes by the Cape? If so, answer my letter, and we shall escape.
Okay, well, some returned options included a Chinese restaurant. So even if they don't like pina coladas, maybe they like a little.
Well, that's diversity, right?
Dim sum. It's a 20,000 square foot dim sum restaurant. It's called Jingfong, and it's in Chinatown. So There's
So we already sang
20,000
the song.
square feet.
We already sang the Rupert Holmes songs,
Yes.
Escape.
Rupert.
And then there's the movie Escape from New York. Parents, are you deciding yet that it's time to escape from New York? Warriors, come out and play. It's time to leave the city behind. There's a great article in the news today that people are abandoning cities like LA and New York in droves. Get your kids the hell out of there. They're literally telling you that we can't send your kids to school because schools are dangerous places. Then they're finding buildings that are remarkably like schools to send your kids.
This one I like, though. There's a cathedral with a 2,500 seat capacity at St. John the Divine in Morningside Heights that's available.
There you go.
Out there. There you go. Plazas, office, and hotel spaces that are not currently in use are being put out there.
Do they give us any rationalization why not going to school is a way to save lives, but sending them to a big cathedral isn't?
No.
No, not a single rationale from these doofuses.
Nothing. They did say they're looking for childcare facilities for 3 and 4-year-olds and learning labs for K-8 students during weekdays when students are not receiving in-person instruction. And when people question how these locations would be vetted, because, all of a sudden the kids are going to be going to the sketch part of, everywhere in New York City, they were directed to Mayor Bill de Blasio's office for answers, so that's going nowhere. And the mayor actually said at one of the daily briefings, we are definitely finding some spaces for that and for childcare. And we'll have much more to say on that in the coming days.
By the way, it's in these cracks in the new system where little maggots like Matthew K. operate. These little non-educator, non-teachers who are getting funneled into your kids' classrooms via Zoom, right? These Planned Parenthood creepy crawlers, people like Matthew K. This is where they get funneled in, right? And so now we're not going to give your kids real school, real time, but we're going to find buildings that look a lot like schools to have your kids learning inclusion and diversity and all the stuff that they were going to get in the school till the school got canceled because of COVID. They're not going to give you the math and science back, but they're going to give you all the Matthew K. stuff.
Well, and that's exactly what you're saying with these cracks. Not at least, but it's still bad. When they were in the school that you send them to and it is taxpayer funded, everything, that's the school. At least you know it's in that building. Now they're taking kids off-site, if you will, to these other buildings, and who knows who's coming into those rooms. In other words,
it's dark site education, right?
That's what it
They're
is.
literally taking your kids and swirling them around little rat holes around the city to give them the crappy non-education that they couldn't give them in public schools if they just opened them. It's quite a racket you got going on, and I guarantee you people like Matthew K. make a lot of money scamming parents and scamming kids.
We know New York City is bad, but hey, so is Florida, where a middle school is going to have, all their middle schoolers take a diversity course because, of course, they're a bunch of racists. All middle schoolers, didn't you know? They're a bunch of racists. So Florida's Palm Beach County District is going to provide an elective course called Prejudice and Power, a discourse on race and ethnicity in the United States. Now, my junior high experience included, I have English next hour, and I have math after that, and I'll go to gym class. But no, they have Prejudice and Power, a discourse on race and ethnicity in the United States.
This is a more educational malfeasance. You tell a young kid, right, that you can go to your algebra class or you can go read Moby Dick. Well, would be.
Stop.
Would be, right? You can go to your algebra class, you got a test coming up. Or you could, instead of taking higher math, we're going to put you in a racial justice class.
Prejudice and Power, a discourse on race and ethnicity in the United States. Why is any middle school course called
That's the kind of garbage you would pay money at a college to take.
Exactly.
A women's studies or a Black Lives Matter seminar or a African American studies course. That's the kind of crap they're offering to your 19 and 20-year-olds. Now your 11 and 12-year-olds can take it.
Exactly.
And when did we decide we were going to start offering racially divisive electives to kids who are 11 years old? And who gets to decide whether they take those or not? Is this a parent decision? Or can the kid just say, I'll forego reading for a semester if I sit in your racial white power workshop?
We'll see. Maybe that's what's going to happen. Okay, the course is going to give young teens the opportunity to engage in dialogue about topics such as structural racism and race as a social construct.
When I talk about racial constructs and the levels of hieratic racial supremacy, I go to the 12. I find a 12-year-old.
I find a 12-year-old.
When I want to talk serious racial sociology, find myself a 12-year-old.
You say SpongeBob, they say that's racist. So a primary focus of the course will be analyzing how racism is predicted on divisiveness and power.
Oh, they can't do algebra because they just skipped algebra, but we're going to have them do statistics.
That's
true. Very nice.
And the power. It's going to examine the history of institutionalized racial and ethnic discrimination that denied certain groups privilege and full human rights under the law. So they can't name who the first president is or anything about the Constitution, but we know it's racist. Statistics. And it will include topics such as slavery, segregation, immigration policy, eugenics, and criminal justice.
So eugenics. I think it's fair to say we're not going to be learning about Margaret Sanger, will we?
Unless we praise her. That's what they would
that's
do
the
somehow.
thing, right? I mean, now we've got, now it's time for the intersectional warriors to come to the defense of this middle school, because what happens when you find out that the eugenicists were all liberals?
What
happens? Progressives, right? What happens? And so now that's where intersectionality allows the 12-year-old to conclude that whatever contradictions there are between the fact that progressives were eugenicists will erase that in the name of intersectionality and blame it on whitey. Mike, don't we have a clip from one of these teachers, these smug little teachers, about how this works?
The course has been in the works for more than a year, but Knowles says recent events surrounding George Floyd's death and the protests that followed called for faster implementation. It's all about student voices, he says.
This is not about a teacher. This is not about my personal beliefs or opinions about issues. This is more so an unbiased, objective approach to just the realities that exist.
Our students are ready and capable, and they want to engage in civil discourse.
Yes, they do. Mr. Knowles, for the record, is the manager of the district's Office of African, African American, Latino, Holocaust, and Gender Studies.
Mr. Knowles,
But
with all due
it's
respect.
not about him.
No, it's not about him. And I love the way, isn't it funny that the progressive left will tell you that there's no such thing as truth? That everybody's biased, that everything has a perspective, that the idea of essentialist truth is a fiction, it's a white supremacist fiction. But you notice the words he uses. It's not my opinion. This is not biased. This is objective. Are you kidding me? Whenever you're dealing with race, you're dealing objectively. You're going to tell this. This was sparked by the George Floyd story, right? And the objective narrative is that this poor innocent guy was whistling down the street when a couple of cops grabbed. That's the Black Lives Matter version. If you have a chance to look at the video that's now been released, you see how much. I'm not justifying the cops at all. I'm simply pointing out when you now look at the camera, the chest camera video, you see this is not an objective issue. That there's a lot more going on, a lot more than the media would tell us. And for Mr. Knowles to sit there and pretend while he's engaging in the worst kind of racial opinionating that all of this is objective while denying any, if I had said to him, it's objectively true that the case is much more complicated than we were told, he'd just call me a white supremacist.
Of course he would. And the thing is, the timing of this is they jumped on it because of George Floyd, but the idea actually spawned way back with the Trayvon Martin case. And it was by a middle school teacher named Jim Ring, who said it's important to teach this before the kids get to high school. I want your comment on his quote. I always look at them like kind of wet cement. You can have more influence, and by the time you get to high school, that cement has hardened.
Wet cement leads to blockheads. That metaphor, that analogy there, I look at my kids as wet cement. That's exactly how they teach your children. Think about cinder blocks. They all look alike. There's no diversity. There's no critical thinking. A cinder block is nothing more than replicating again and again and again something that's useful for the progressives, but has no independence, no individuality, no personality, no personhood. Wet cement solidifies into block-headed liberal progressive thinking that can't be moved by logic, that even science now can't convince a block-headed liberal to change his mind. That's what you're getting with these kids. And before we step off this topic, go back to the young, don't you have to play the clip again, but that woman at the last 5 seconds, our students at 11, 12 are willing to engage in civil discourse. Well, how come we don't hear from them?
It's time for for some real education. John Gillespie McGee Jr. was a World War II Royal Canadian Air Force fighter pilot and poet who wrote the poem High Flight. He was killed in an accidental mid-air collision over England in 1941. McGee's posthumous fame rests mainly on his sonnet High Flight, which he started on August 18, 1941, just a few months before his death at the age of 19. The first person to read McGee's poem later that same day in the officers' mess was his fellow pilot officer Michael Henry Labat, with whom McGee had trained.
Yeah, and I want to say at the beginning that this beautiful poem was recommended to us by our Canadian listener, viewer, Stacy Dittman. Stacy, thank you so much for watching the show, and thank you for recommending this really wonderful little poem that I did not know existed. We should also thank you, Stacy, for Canadians, because you've given the world Trudeau, which actually makes Barack Obama look kind of masculine. So we want to thank you to our Canadian brethren for that as well. This poem was written on the back of a letter that was hastily constructed. 14-line poem described McGee's feelings during the flight, what it was like to leave the surly bonds of Earth. High Flight was designated as the official poem of the Royal Air Force and the Royal Canadian Air Force, which is really cool. U.S. Air Force Colonel James Irwin, Apollo 15 lunar modular pilot, took a copy of this poem to the moon. So unlike a lot of poets, much better known, this particular poem is on the moon, and President Ronald Reagan quoted this poem very poignantly in the midst of the Space Shuttle Challenger tragedy, that beautiful speech that Reagan gave. Give us a sense of the poem here, Mike. It's all about a young pilot, a young earthbound boy who, at 19 years old, takes to flight because of the war. And what is his experience being able to fly? He writes, "Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of Earth and danced the skies on laughter's silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or ever eagle flew, and wild with silent lifting mind I've trod the high untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God." Beautiful stuff, right? And so what this meant to leave the Earth when flight was not quite as cliche as it is now. Everybody's been on a plane. Everybody knows what it's like. But back then, it was something still new for thousands of generations of human beings who had lived without the capacity to do it. So it's a beautiful poem. Doesn't need a lot of explanation, right? But the idea that the joy of flight brought him closer to the creator of the world. And a lot of people, pilots say that there's a serenity, a peace, a spirituality being up alone flying among the clouds. It's too bad that within a few months he'd be dead, but his legacy well outlived that particular tragedy.
All right, as always, you can follow us on Facebook and Parler. And if you have any questions, feel free to visit freedomproject.com/AskDuke and send those questions our way. Now we're going to wrap things up with our fun fact of the day. Back in 2015, 5 years ago, it could cost more than $289,000 for a one-year permit for a hot dog stand in Central Park in New York. So we're talking 5 years later. How much is real estate rental cost going to be now for our school buildings that we're going to put together?
$289,000
for a one-year
to sell hot dogs.
permit.
When did trade in cow lips and buttholes become so lucrative? And that's our show. For Freedom Project, I'm Dr. Duke. She's Katie. Until next time, stay educated, my friends.